The third issue was something that occurred in 1844. And what it had to do with is this wave of anti-immigrant feeling that was sweeping through many of the big cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia. As Catholics were concentrated in those big cities, there was a backlash against them, particularly as immigrants. And in Philadelphia in May of 1844, there was a series of riots. 2 Catholic churches were burned, 13 people were killed, hundreds of Catholic homes at least were damaged. It was organized by a group who called themselves the Native American Party, or the Nativists for short. That was their way of distinguishing themselves from these immigrants. They claimed that they were against all immigrants. They really weren't. Their objection really was to Catholic immigrants. But after these riots in Philadelphia, the leaders of this Native American Party announced they would come to New York, and they were going to hold a big rally in the park in front of City Hall. And what they hoped is that would provoke riots and demonstrations in New York similar to the ones in Philadelphia. This, in some respects, was Hughes' finest hour. He went to the mayor, and he said to the mayor, if anything happens to any one of my churches, this city will become another Moscow. What he was referring to was what happened in Moscow in 1812. Remember when Napoleon invaded Russia? Alexander I burned Moscow to keep the French from occupying it. He was threatening to do the same thing. He also claimed later on that he had put armed guards around all of his churches. He said he put between 1,000 and 2,000 armed guards around every one of the churches in the city. Now, there were 12 Catholic churches. That would have meant an army of between 12,000 and 24,000 men. Almost certainly he was exaggerating. But the fact of the matter is that tough talk, those threats did the trick. And New York was spared the kind of mob violence that racked Philadelphia a few weeks earlier. There's no doubt Hughes' rhetoric didn't have much in common with the Sermon on the Mount. But it was effective. And the best historian of that whole nativist movement, Ray Allen Billington, who was not a Catholic, he gives Hughes high marks for his tough stand. He said it was the only way to preserve law and order in the city, and it worked. I said I would not go on too long, but give me perhaps just 5 minutes to mention his role as a diocesan administrator. I say when he came here, almost nothing had been done. The diocese was the whole state and half of New Jersey. There were maybe 22 churches, 40 priests in that whole vast area. You know, in that area today, there are 11 dioceses, over 2,000 churches, over 6,000 priests, and 10 million Catholics. In that area where John Hughes was bishop when he came here in 1839. In the course of his 25 years here, he dedicated, he said, at least 99 churches. At one point he said he was dedicating a new parish church every 10 weeks. Almost nothing had been done in terms of Catholic schools. He's the one who really began this system here. When he found he could not get any share of state money from, as the Public School Society did, he decided to build his own school system. And of course he never could have done it, except at the time the numbers of women religious were growing by leaps and bounds. And they're the ones who really made possible the whole Catholic school system. I say, he wrote a pastoral letter in 1850. He said, the time has almost come. We must build the schoolhouse first and then the church. He also gave New York his first Catholic hospital, St. Vincent's. His own sister, Angela Hughes, was the founder of it. He also gave this diocese an institution that's now gone. But it was a home for kids who otherwise would have wound up in jail. The Catholic Protectorate it was called. And it was located up where Parkchester is today. When that closed in 1939, it's estimated they had taken care of 100,000 kids who otherwise would have wound up in reform schools or even prisons. Hughes gave the diocese an infrastructure it didn't have before. I might just also mention When he came here, there was only one religious community in the diocese, the Sisters of Charity. It was he who brought in the Religious of the Sacred Heart, the Sisters of Mercy from Dublin, the Ursulines, the School Sisters of Notre Dame for the Germans, and I forget what the last one was, but I'm sorry, I just forget. There was still another community of women religious. And likewise with regard, there was not a single religious order of men. It was he who invited the Jesuits to come back, brought in the Redemptorists, the Fathers of Mercy, the Christian Brothers. So on so many different levels, he built up this diocese where there was very little before. Might just also mention, by the time he died, the diocese was 1/10 the original size. In 1847, the new dioceses were made in Albany and Buffalo. And 6 years later, a new diocese in Brooklyn and in Newark. So by the time he died in 1864, the diocese was its present size, 10% of what it had once been. But half of the city was probably Catholic. In 1864, it's estimated 1 out of every 4 New Yorkers was born in Ireland. 1 out of every 6 or 7 was born in Germany. Now, they weren't all Catholic, but many were. But by 1864, probably half the population of the city, maybe 350,000 out of 700,000, were Catholics. Now, a lot of that would have happened no matter who was the archbishop. But Hughes didn't give a guidance and direction that no one had done before. I don't mean to put him up on a pedestal because he certainly had severe limitations. He took almost no interest in the Germans or the Italians, and even less in African Americans. He was very much a bishop for his fellow Irish immigrants. He had severe limitations. He had very little education. Someone said one time, what would it have been like if Hughes had been educated, say, in Rome or Paris? And the person answered that and said, well, what would Lincoln have been like if he'd gone to Harvard? He wouldn't have been Lincoln. And John Hughes wouldn't have been Hughes either if he had gotten a European education. In fact, when it was proposed that he should get a red hat, the Archbishop of Baltimore wrote to Rome and said, don't give it to him. He doesn't have the polish or the education that a cardinal should have. There's no doubt about his limitations. And he also was a very pugnacious, authoritarian leader. He consulted nobody. There's that famous story when two Irish priests complained he was violating their rights in canon law. And he said, I'll teach them County Monaghan canon law. And I'll send them back to the bogs they came from. Well, it's a funny story, but that's not a sign of good leadership, as I think we all recognize. But considering the circumstances, you know, if you drew up a balance sheet, the plus side would certainly have a lot more in it than the negative side. And that's true, I suppose, of everyone. He had severe limitations, but in many ways he was the right man for that moment. He built up the infrastructure of the diocese, and perhaps more than anything else, he gave direction, he gave leadership to this beleaguered immigrant community when they had very few lay leaders who could do it for them. So let me quit while I'm still ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Monsignor, for your thoughtful, interesting, humorous, and wonderfully informative tracing of our history and its significance to our faith community and this great city.